In 1913, the pits of one narrow Welsh valley cut over 9.5 million tonnes of coal. Down in Cardiff, in a hall of oak and marble, it is said a man once signed a cheque for a full £1,000,000 without leaving his seat. Yet a few miles north, in the valley that dug every ton of it, families shared one cold tap between whole streets, and buried children lost to diseases money could have cured. Those same villages are today among the poorest in Britain. This is the story of the Rhondda. It is the story of the richest coalfield the world had ever seen, and of the people who lived on top of all that wealth without ever being allowed to keep it. Because the Rhondda was never truly a rich place, it was a place that made other places rich. It made Cardiff rich. It made a handful of coal owners rich enough to buy titles and country houses. And it made the British Empire rich in the one thing that empire could not run without. What the valley kept for itself was the coal dust, the danger, and in the end, the silence. But before the pit wheels turned, before the tramways and the terraced streets, there was almost nothing at all. Just a river, a wooded valley, and a few hundred farmers who had no idea what lay beneath their fields. In the year 1801, the whole of the Rhondda was home to about 540 people, sheep farmers mostly, scattered along two rivers that run down out of the hills of Glamorgan. The larger of the two is the Rhondda Fawr, the Great Rhondda. The smaller is the Rhondda Fach. They meet at a village called Porth, whose name means gateway, and together they carve a valley barely more than a dozen miles long. A traveller passing through in those years would have described it much the way one historian later did, as a quiet, wooded, pastoral place, green and almost empty, and utterly unaware of what it was sitting on. What none of them could see was that the ground beneath their feet held some of the finest steam coal on the planet. Coal is not simply coal. Some of it burns dirty and slow, choking a furnace with smoke and clinker. But the seams beneath the Rhondda were something else entirely. This coal burned hot, it burned clean, and it left almost no smoke behind. For a world that was rebuilding itself around the steam engine, that was close to a miracle. Smokeless coal meant a warship could raise steam without giving away its position on the horizon. It meant a liner could cross an ocean on less fuel. In 1851, two government scientists were sent to test the steam coals of South Wales, and their report to the Admiralty was decisive. This, they said, was the coal the Royal Navy ought to burn. There is a story that an admiral stranded with his fleet in the Baltic wrote home with a single desperate demand. Send him Welsh coal, he insisted, or he could not answer for the safety of his ships. From that moment, the fate of the valley was sealed. In 1855, the first trainload of steam coal was hauled out of the pits at Treherbert and sent rattling down the line toward Cardiff, and the world came looking for more. What followed was one of the fastest transformations any corner of Britain has ever seen. Investors and speculators poured in, sinking shafts deeper and deeper into the rock, chasing the great 4-foot seam down through hundreds of yards of stone. Men like Walter Coffin, who had pioneered the early pits, and David Davies, who sank his fortune and his nerve into the deep steam coal, built empires out of the dark. And behind the owners came the workers, tens of thousands of them, drawn from rural Wales, from the west of England, from Ireland, and further still. Between the 1850s and the First World War, more than 300,000 people flooded into the South Wales coalfield. The Rhondda, which had counted a few hundred souls at the start of the century, held over 150,000 by 1911. There was no room to build. The pits took the floor of the valley, so the houses climbed the hillsides instead. Long grey terraces of local sandstone stacked one above another, so steep that in places the back door of one row opened almost level with the chimneys of the row below. In 60 years, a green and empty valley had become the most crowded industrial landscape in the country. And above it all rose the man who would carry the valley's name out into the wider world. His name was David Alfred Thomas, and everyone simply called him D.A. He was a coal owner, a member of Parliament, and a Victorian to his bones, a man who once described life as a tournament that handed out glittering prizes to the bold. Through the 1890s and into the new century, he swallowed colliery after colliery into a single vast enterprise called the Cambrian Combine, built on a capital of £2 million and producing something like 6 million tonnes of coal a year. At the height of it, he sat on more than 40 company boards at once. He would end his life as the first Viscount Rhondda, taking the valley's own name for his title. One miners' leader summed him up in a single line. He had, the man said, the income of a duke and the tastes of a peasant, and all of that wealth flowed in one direction, downward and outward, along the railways, down to the docks at Cardiff and Barry, and into a grand building near the Cardiff waterfront called the Coal Exchange. This was the beating heart of the global coal trade. Owners, ship owners and their agents met on its trading floor every day, and at the busiest hour around the middle of the day, as many as 200 men might be shouting and gesturing and striking deals at once. It was here, the story goes, that the world's first cheque for a full £1 million was written and signed. Not for gold, not for land, not for anything you could hold in your hand, for coal. For the black rock being torn out of a valley most of those traders would never once set foot in. By 1913, the Rhondda reached its peak, and the numbers are still difficult to take in. In that single year, its pits cut over 9.5 million tonnes of coal. Across the wider South Wales coalfield, 250,000 men hauled up 57 million tonnes. In the Rhondda alone, more than 40,000 men worked underground, in over 50 separate collieries crammed into those 12 miles of valley. It had become, in the phrase of the time, the most densely peopled mining district in the world, and this coal did far more than warm British hearths. It fed the fleet that policed a quarter of the globe. Rhondda steam coal sat waiting in coaling stations from Gibraltar to Hong Kong, ready to fill the bunkers of the Royal Navy and the great merchant lines. If the British Empire was an engine, then for a few decades this one narrow Welsh valley was a good part of the fuel that kept it turning. On the surface, a whole civilization had grown to match. There were chapels on almost every street, and on a Sunday evening the sound of hymn singing would spill out of their doors, and out of that came the male voice choirs that Wales is still known for the world over. There were brass bands, there were miners' institutes with reading rooms and libraries paid for penny by penny out of the men's own wages. There was rugby, and there was a fierce, questioning, radical politics. One village up the Rhondda Valley, a place called Maerdy, grew so devoted to the socialist and communist cause that the rest of Britain took to calling it Little Moscow. The people who filled these streets had come from everywhere. Welsh-speaking families down from the hills, labourers up from the English counties, a scattering of Italian cafe owners and Jewish shopkeepers who arrived around the turn of the century to serve the crowds. And in the miners' institutes, men who had left school as boys taught themselves economics and philosophy and politics late into the night, building one of the best read working class cultures Britain has ever produced. but you have to hold two pictures in your mind at the very same time, because underneath the choirs and the chapels and the record tonnages, the men and women who made all this wealth were living lives that the wealth itself never reached. Their houses had been thrown up fast and cheap. Clean water was hard to come by, sanitation was worse, and diseases like tuberculosis and rickets moved easily through the crowded, damp terraces. Malnutrition was common. Far too many children died far too young. And then there was the work itself. To go down a Rhondda pit was to walk into gas and dust, and the ever-present chance of the roof coming down. At Zimmer near Porth, an explosion in 1856 killed 114 men and boys, some of them only 10 years old. At Ferndale in 1867, 178 were lost. At Merdy in 1885, 81. Across the long span of the coal years, something like 850 men and boys were killed digging in this single valley. The richest coalfield on earth was also one of the most lethal, and even in the best years, the money that reached them was never truly their own to count on. For a long stretch, miners' pay across South Wales was governed by what was called the sliding scale, an arrangement that tied their wages directly to the selling price of coal. When the price rose, the men saw a little more. When it fell, their pay was cut to match. Whatever the cost of bread that week, whatever the rent was owing, a collier could break his body cutting a record tonnage and still carry home less than he had the year before, simply because buyers in some distant port had pushed the price down. The owners kept the profit in the good years and passed the losses down the shaft in the bad ones. It was a way of making certain that the people who took on all of the risk saw the very least of the reward, and it bred a slow, deep resentment that no amount of chapel singing could ever quite wash away.
And here is the contradiction that would eventually tear the whole place apart. The valley that fueled the world's navies could not or would not guarantee a living wage to the very men who fueled them. For years that anger stayed buried, packed down as tight as the coal itself. Then, in the autumn of 1910, it broke through to the surface, and the entire country was forced to stop and watch. It began with an argument over a difficult seam at a pit called the Ely in Pennygraig. The owners, part of D.A. Thomas's Cambrian Combine, accused the miners of deliberately working too slowly. The miners answered that the coal there was simply harder to cut, and that they were being cheated of a fair rate for it. By that November, around 12,000 men across the Combine were out on strike, and they had shut down nearly every pit in the mid-Rhondda. On the night of the 8th of November, thousands of strikers clashed with police outside the colliery at Lewinipia, and the fighting spilled down into the square at the little town of Tony Pandy. Shop windows were smashed, around 60 of them, and looted. One miner, a man named Samuel Rees, died from injuries to his head, most likely struck down by a policeman. And into this stepped the young Home Secretary of the day, Winston Churchill, who sent police reinforcements and put soldiers on standby to move into the valley. What happened next has been argued over ever since. In the popular memory of Wales, the version passed down for generations. Churchill sent the army in to crush the miners, and the bitterness of that has lasted more than 100 years. Historians tend to be more careful. The surviving record suggests Churchill actually held the troops back at first, pushing London police ahead of them, and that the soldiers, when they finally did arrive, behaved with a good deal of restraint. But for the men of the Rhondda, the effect was the same. The weight of the state broke the strike's momentum. When the miners at last went back to work in the autumn of 1911, almost a full year after they had walked out, they went back beaten, forced to accept the very rate they had gone on strike to refuse. Many years later, a British Prime Minister would still talk of the sullen tramp of marching feet at Tony Pandy. The valley had learned its bitter lesson. The wealth was never theirs, and if they reached for it, the full force of the country would come down to stop them. The strange, cruel thing is that the Rhondda's peak and the beginning of its end arrived almost hand in hand. 1913 was the record year. Within a single decade, the whole foundation beneath it was crumbling. After the First World War, the world began to change its fuel. Navies and shipping lines turned away from coal and toward oil, and demand for steam coal fell away. Worse still, the very thing that had made the valley rich was starting to run out. The easy, thick seams were being worked to exhaustion, and what remained lay deeper and cost more to reach. The pits themselves were growing old. By the middle of the century, while coalfields elsewhere in Britain were cutting most of their coal by machine, South Wales was still hewing most of it out by older, slower, more expensive means. The valley that had once led the world was now falling steadily behind it. Then came the blows that had nothing to do with geology. In 1926, the miners were locked into a bitter national dispute, and for a few days the whole of working Britain stood beside them in a general strike. But that wider support collapsed inside a week, and the miners were left to fight on alone. They held out for months, until sheer hunger drove them back to work on the owners' terms. The bitterness of that year never truly healed. The 1930s were worse again. As the pits shut, work simply evaporated. At the lowest point, close to half of all the working men in the Rhondda had no job at all, and so the people began to do the only thing left open to them. They left. Over the decades that followed, the valley lost more than a third of its entire population, as family after family packed up and went in search of work in England or further afield. There was a brief reprieve during the Second World War, when the country needed coal again, and new factories opened in the towns nearby. And in 1947, the mines were taken into public ownership, in the hope that the state might save what the market was busy killing. But no Act of Parliament could put coal back into a seam that was already worked out. One by one, decade after decade, the pits of the Rhondda fell quiet. This was the real cruelty of it. There was no single catastrophe here, no one dreadful night when everything was lost at once. There was only a long, slow unwinding, a valley being hollowed out so gradually that from one year to the next, you could almost persuade yourself it might still turn around. It never did. By the end of the 1980s, only a single pit was left. It stood at Maerdy, at the very head of the Rhondda Fac, the same little Moscow that had never once allowed a strikebreaker to cross its picket line. And in December of 1990, Maerdy closed. The last day reads almost like a funeral. In the days beforehand, the miners' wives and families were taken down into the pit to see, for the first and last time, the world where the men had spent their lives. On the final shift, the colliers were allowed to break off souvenir chunks of the 5-foot seam, and then they rode up to the surface and gathered in the canteen to sing carols. A local band led a procession up through the streets, and the men walked behind their union banner one last time. Of the 300 still working there, only 17 chose to transfer to another pit elsewhere. For the first time in roughly 140 years, there was no coal being cut anywhere in the Rhondda at all. You can still go and stand near where it happened. At Trehafod, the old Lewis Merthyr colliery has been turned into the Rhondda Heritage Park, its winding gear kept standing against the sky. The very last dram of Maerdy coal preserved on display. Former colliers take visitors down into the workings to show them the world that has gone, and the villages themselves are still there, still clinging to their hillsides in those long grey terraces. But the prosperity never came back. The places whose names once meant coal that powered an empire, places like Tylerstown and Ferndale and Maerdy, now sit among the most deprived communities anywhere in Wales. Some of them lodged near the bottom of the tables for as long as anyone has bothered to keep them. Incomes here run below the average for Wales, which itself sits below the average for Britain. The wealth, it turned out, had never really lived in the Rhondda. When the coal finally gave out, the one thing that stayed behind was the loss, which brings us back to that hall in Cardiff and the cheque for £1 million. It is an easy scene to picture, the oak panelling, the roar of 200 voices on the trading floor, the ink drying on a fortune. What the picture leaves out is everything that fortune was actually made of. The 10-year-old boys carried out of Simmer, the whole street sharing one cold tap, the men trudging home beaten from Tony Pandy. The coal that warmed the world was cut, always by people the world was more than happy to forget. The Rhondda was called the richest mining valley on earth, and in a strange way it truly was. It is only that the riches were forever passing through. They were signed away in a Cardiff hall, loaded onto ships at a Cardiff dock, and carried off to fuel a fleet the men of the valley would never once sail on. What the Rhondda was finally left with was the memory of having been needed, and the long quiet that came after. If this story was worth your time, do think about subscribing so the next one finds you. And if you would like to keep watching, YouTube reckons you are going to enjoy the video now, waiting on your screen.